Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, if it happens to be afternoon where you are, or evening, if it's somebody who's international. I'm I'm really excited to be here, and my role at Inflexion is a principal researcher. I've been working in education for about 15 years now, never as a classroom teacher, always in sort of a support role and strategy development role, and now as a researcher. And my work generally focuses on really this question of student engagement, and also on educator development. And the majority of my work is around creativity and arts integration to that end. But we also have some projects focused on identity development for students and really harnessing the power of those kind of cultural values and different identity orientations that students bring to the classroom and the complexity around that. And so, I guess the theme of my work and how I look at it is to actually look more at the complexity and kind of really harness that complexity and think about what we can do, really to serve our most marginalized students furthest from opportunity with the most exciting and engaging learning opportunities possible. And really at the heart of it is kind of generating a culture of well-being in a school. And a lot of that begins with our teachers first. So that's just a nutshell of where I'm coming from. If you want to advance the slide, Brandy.
Sure.
The big project that I'm working on now is called Makespace, and this is where I've met Desiree Kiesel, who's going to introduce herself next. Just giving you a little snapshot of this project. It is focused right now on really rural schools in Oregon, but we have a few more kind of urban environments as well. It's self-paced, self-guided online training that's being designed to really look at ownership for teachers, and then how does that get modeled and brought into the classroom, and through creative engagement. And so what are the conditions for creative engagement in learning, and how does creativity really infuse into teaching and learning to enhance relationships? And one of the primary ingredients being shared vulnerability and expression, and the sort of extension is that we bring in more cultural relevance and more social emotional growth, and looking at the micro moments of ownership to kind of build out a culture of ownership of learning in the classroom, really centered on opportunities in creativity. And so Desiree has been we've been working alongside each other for a couple of years now in this project. So I'll kick it over to you, Desiree.
Okay. Hi, my name is Desiree Kiesel, and I am the principal of the Woodburn Arts and Communications Academy, WACA. Woodburn, if you don't know, is kind of an unusual schooling system. About 15 years ago, we were identified as a failing school right at the kind of crux of No Child Left Behind, and we're on the precipice of being reconstituted because of failing test scores. And so at the time, Woodburn engaged in the small schools movement headed by, at that point, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. And we took our large comprehensive high school and broke it up into 4 autonomous high schools on one campus. So WACA is one of them. We focus on arts and communications for students. And really the premise of the small schools movement very much connected to ownership, right? It was about how do we create schooling environments that are about relevant learning opportunities for students by, kind of keying into their passions and their interests and trying to develop a teaching and learning framework that really embraced those. So I've been principal here for about 4 years. Before I was principal, I actually taught at WACA and was helped kind of create the vision for our school. I left for a few years, did a few other administrative positions, and then was able to come back this last year or 4 years ago to kind of take up the helm of WACA and push us forward. And for us, that's where Makespace came in as we started to revitalize our teaching and learning framework and figure out how to once again kind of key into those high interest areas of our students, particularly within WACA, because they pick WACA because of a deep love of the arts and theater and music. So. And there on the screen is some demographics of Woodburn. If you, I always joke with Ross because I think it's funny that we got identified as a rural school, because in some ways Woodburn is pretty rural in the sense that we aren't necessarily a major hub. We don't have a movie theater. We don't have a regular theater. We don't have a lot of different things. At the same time, we're only about 20 minutes north of Salem and only about 30 minutes south of Portland. So we're not like rural in a real sense of the word. We'll also have the biggest outlet mall in Oregon. So I don't know who could consider us rural, but at the same time, we have some unique demographics that are really unique to Woodburn in specific, one of which is our student body. We have a really large Hispanic population, and within that, a lot of English language learners, a pretty significant population also of students who are newcomers to the United States or have limited formal education or interrupted formal education. And so those are things that we are constantly needing to adapt our model to make sure we're best serving the needs of our students.
Yeah. So before we dive into what we're talking about with ownership of learning, we wanted to get a sense from everybody who's on this webinar, what they think about when they hear ownership of learning. So if you want to respond to this poll everywhere with some ideas, this will be helpful to see where we're starting. So feelings of excitement, choice seems to be a big theme. Scholars who are in charge of what they're doing. Self-direction within a culturally responsive classroom. Engage in the process of what their outcome will look like. That's key. Self-advocacy, student interest and internal motivation, what's going on inside of a student, how they're thinking about what they're doing and feeling about what they're doing. Voice and choice again, empowerment, work that's student-led, know what we know and what we don't know for ourselves and our students. Curiosity, taking responsibility for learning, it's great. It's a wonderful start. Perhaps let's advance the slide, and I'm going to provide, oh, well, if there's still some coming in, I don't want to, okay. So if you could just click on the next, this is animated, so what do we know about ownership of learning? So if you can just click through, Brandy. One, when students feel agentic, and when we mean agentic, there's a lot of terms that are kind of revolving around ownership of learning, and one of them is sense of agency. And what we mean by sense of agency or feeling agentic is not just having control or choice, it's also valuing what you're doing and feeling like you have the competency and the confidence to actually succeed at what you're doing, so that you can make a difference, that you can actually create change, or even just if it's in a small task, like have some choice around what you're doing and how you're going to succeed. And as somebody mentioned before, also what is the outcome? How much control do you have over the outcome? So when students feel agentic, they ask for help. They also feel ready to seek help and confident to seek help. And they let teachers know what they need and feel more confident. And the research around agentic engagement is really cool because it's suggesting that this is a proactive aspect of how students engage, that there's initiative, that there's a level of involvement. Feeling autonomous is kind of synonymous with feeling free a little bit, and actually having volition and will in what you're doing and choice. And there is research definitely that points to this being key to motivating students and definitely key to academic success. So the next slide, or the next bullet here. So feeling ownership involves some of this responsibility, taking responsibility. It involves some of that, the agency. So actually valuing what you're doing and having some internal interest and an intrinsic interest and drive. And also the autonomy of being able to take risks and make choices and decisions along the way. And so what's cool is that we do know that when there is more ownership being felt by students, they're going to be more cognitively engaged, affectively or emotionally engaged, and behaviorally engaged. So it's kind of the first step towards those other types of engagement, agentic engagement or ownership. And the other pieces that we know from research is that the key ingredients, which will not be a surprise to anybody here, to agency, autonomy, and ownership are relationships. Relationships. And inside those relationships, what do they see modeled? What do they hear messaged? And how does that create more trust and more reciprocity in how a classroom is run and how decisions are made? And the next bullet here is important. This is like the most essential thing. And this is actually more important, according to research, more important than choice. So choice can be helpful, but actually it's not the critical piece for kids. If they're being asked to do something, if they have voice and that you have shown that their opinion matters and their perspective matters, choice is not actually the most important thing, according to some of the research. So the next step here, we're going to cover a little bit of this in the context of what I think Desiree is going to share and talk about, but just framing this, and this is in the PDF that was just shared, kind of breaks down some of these essential elements. Organizing learning for student ownership means that they have the opportunity to decide on what success is going to look like. What should success be? What are their goals? And so that's where the criteria for success aligns to their goals. Deciding on the workflow and the timeline and, what milestones should they hit and how are they going to reach that? And of course it's in communication with a teacher, but the more decision that they have along the way, the more ownership they're going to feel. And that's intuitive. If they can set classroom norms and be involved in what kinds of rules or norms are going to dictate how people are treating each other, how they take accountability, especially within group work. Facing uncertainty, this is where the aspect of creativity comes in, and it's so important. Being able to actually face uncertainty, not knowing exactly what the right choice is going to be, what the right step is going to be, and it means taking a risk and taking responsibility for the choice that's being made. And that uncertainty is often planned out of the learning. So it's kind of about planning back in and organizing learning back, around some spaces for uncertainty and scaffolding it so that kids can feel ready. And then teaching or leading the class, sharing with others some of their expertise or some of what they've learned or the process that worked for them. And that sharing and aspect of sharing can happen on a daily basis, really. So next slide. And we're going to get now a little bit more into like the integration of, so what does it look like? What are we looking for in the integration of ownership of learning into the classroom? And if students have the opportunity to actually hear and think about how and why what they're doing is valuable, that actually, again, matters more than choice. So there's research around science. How important is it for teachers to share why science is relevant and that what they're learning in science is relevant? And it's actually really important. Interest goes up for kids around science. Ideas and motivation about what they're going to do in the future with science goes up. And what research has found is that these relevant statements are actually really minimal if you kind of look across classrooms on a regular basis. So why and how is what they're learning relevant? Choosing topics or what they're going to learn with, what kind of materials, being a resource for peer feedback, formulating personal goals, expressing opinions and preferences, being creative. Any opportunities for creativity seem to really generate more engagement for kids. It's where they're fueled, their personal interest and investment is fueled. And then seeing and hearing how making mistakes is normal. This is so critical, especially for kids who are marginalized by all kinds of inequities. There's so much more pressure set up for not making mistakes and making it feel like any mistake that's made or failure is diagnostic to them not really being a fit or belonging, and they don't feel like they belong. And a lot of that can just be about whether or not internally they're diagnosing themselves as not being capable facing a mistake. And so the more normative, the more stories that are heard. So this gets at some of the research around, if you share stories about scientists that only focus on achievement of the scientists, it actually doesn't stimulate new interest. If you focus on the amount of mistakes that they made to get to those accomplishments, suddenly interest goes way up and students actually feel more capable because it's a vicarious experience and it just normalizes failure and setbacks. So that one is, in the research we're doing, that one seems to be super key, and especially for kids who are underrepresented or marginalized in some fields. And all right, that's a lot of talking at you all. So let's get to, I think we're going to go to another poll. Oh no, actually, first we're gonna turn this over to Desiree. Desiree, can you share a little bit about how your school got involved in the Makespace project? But also, what kinds of initiatives are right now around you, and what feels like, highest priority?
Sure. So in terms of the involvement in Makespace, to be honest, I feel like it was almost kind of a fluke. Ross and I had met when I worked for the Oregon Department of Education, and I got a random email, and I'm like, I think I know this guy. And so he was reaching out to Woodburn because we fell within the parameters of the Makespace grant that they were going after. I will tell you more around the reasons why we said yes. And for us, it was really the concept that while WACA was an art school, what we were recognizing is that we had kind of strayed from some of that core vision of being an art school in our core classes. And so students were getting this really robust and meaningful arts experience in their arts classrooms, but not necessarily finding transference to their regular classrooms and their core classrooms. And when I came on as principal, we started to embrace this concept of being a scholar artist. How does the arts make our core content stronger, and how does our core content actually inform our artistic endeavors? And so Makespace was just this really great fit in terms of giving our teachers some strategies and techniques that they could use to kind of look at arts as a way of understanding and a way of knowing. Like, how do we explore stuff and really think through a lens of creativity that we naturally have because they chose WACA. They came here because they were attracted to that creative thinking process to begin with. And so we were really fortunate. And right now within those spaces, we see our teachers really embracing the concepts that were really embedded in Makespace, which include, like, how do we use those skills that our students are naturally attracted to and say, there's a way to apply this so that you understand something else better. I had a great conversation with one of my math teachers who she has embraced Makespace in a way that I can't even fully describe. And we had work together on a particularly rough lesson. I think all teachers right now are still grappling with what does this CDL look like, and Woodburn is still in the throes of just doing online learning, and specifically doing online learning with a lot of students that didn't have great internet access or computer and technology access at home prior to the pandemic. It's ironic that you can be right on the I-5 corridor and not have major internet services provided to you. We don't have Comcast. We don't have a lot of the ones that are available north and south of us. And so having teachers incorporate technology is something that they had actually steered away from prior, because a lot of kids just didn't have access outside of the classroom. So I was working with this teacher, and we were kind of going through what had not gone really well in one of her lessons. And she said, the next day I kind of channeled my inner Makespace and I started drawing. And she found a tool that she could project for kids. And she was drawing out representation of the math concept, and suddenly kids were pinging all over the place, understanding it in a different way. So that's really where we're starting to see Makespace have the biggest impact. It's like how we can key into another way of understanding that students have at their disposal, but that we don't always take advantage of, especially in our core areas. Connected to that, the other kind of place that we're really diving in deep right now, and I'm thinking a lot about it as you were talking, Roth, about just how do you create elements of autonomy and mastery, et cetera. We're doing a lot around culturally responsive and culturally relevant learning, and specifically focusing on like how to be kind of that anti-racist teacher. And so I think connected to that, one of the big questions we're exploring right now is when we talk about purpose and when we talk about the why behind the work, that often it's really centered on our experiences as educators. Like, why is this important? Because I'll tell you why it's important, and I'm going to give you all the reasons from my cultural experience, my cultural lens about why this is really important. And for a lot of our students, it's like, that is not important to me, right? And so I think that's the other place where we're really focusing our work, is how do we find that integration between the Makespace work and the cultural relevancy, including the fact that WACA in and of itself is its own culture, and the arts are within its own culture. So how do we take a creative cultural lens to the work we're doing?
Oh, that's a great insight. And it complements, one of these points from research, especially the research around science and relevance. It's like actually generating value statements around what is being learned by students and having that be part of the inquiry. Like, why are we learning this anyway? Let's like dig in and find out. I mean, that becomes an ownership step.
Yeah, and
that's great.
That ownership step, and it goes to the relationship point you made, right? It's how do I know my students well enough and deeply enough that when I create that relevance, I'm actually keying into the specific thing they know. So, it was really, I had a great discussion with one of my math teachers again, where he's a geometry teacher. He was trying to explain why ratios were really important. And for him personally, as a geometry teacher, ratios are really important. And he was explaining all the reasons why ratios are really important. And his comment to me was, and then suddenly I realized, like, as a white man, I'm telling these kids that have not had the same cultural experience and don't want to be math teachers when they grow up, why this is important. And so he turned to one of his students and says, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to own a salon. And he goes, ratios are important to you. And they started talking about hair dye, right? It's something as simple as that like you have to connect, but it took the relationship to get to that level of connection, because suddenly math was important to this girl that 5 minutes ago, it was like, are you kidding me? Why are you telling me this? So,
and she wouldn't have shared that if she had been afraid that he might, say it was a dumb goal, or, oh, you can do better. Or, if in any way she feared that maybe he would in some way downplay or discourage her and that dream. And so that's like the key, the relationship, right? It's like you have that trust already. You've built that trust. You've put that time in. Every day you're nurturing it. We all know as adults how quickly you can lose that trust. It can be, it takes so long to develop and gain and sustain, and then you can very quickly lose it. So it's like, it's being vulnerable by recognizing, well, that last lesson didn't go so well. Maybe I did it too much from my point of view, like asking for feedback from students and not being afraid of what you might hear. That's all really, I mean, some of the stories that I've heard out of teachers when we've done focus groups, we've gotten to know your teachers really well through this project. And, one of the teachers that comes to mind is, a teacher who was also a visual arts teacher, but was having a lot of trouble with engagement and relationship building. And it was demoralizing. I mean, it was, privately, candidly saying, like, I don't know if I'm going to be a teacher very much longer. And a lot of discipline referrals, not really knowing how do you establish that rapport and then sustain that rapport. And after doing some of the Makespace work of just thinking about, well, what can you do with theater and very basic theater games, right? These games that are really about thinking with your body, thinking on your feet, sharing in performance and all of that kind of vulnerability of performing in front of people, even if it's just a small little thing. And it was fascinating to talk to him 3 months after starting the school year, that following school year. And he said, this is being able to bring these theater exercises into this visual arts class, was set this foundation of relationship building that, and being vulnerable and being playful and, just being on that level. And I think he was, super proud of not having a single discipline referral that entire year. And for 5 months. It's like, there's no magic bullet except like it's about that vulnerability of stepping in and saying, all right, how can I develop in every learning opportunity, this conversation, make it a conversation. And your students are, from what I haven't even gotten to really you meet your students so much because the pandemic has hit, but what I gather is, they're going to tell you, if you ask them, they're going to tell you their honest opinion. And most students will, and we're kind of afraid to actually ask for those opinions and perspectives. And you can't really have autonomy and ownership and agency if you don't value those opinions and perspectives. And so it's kind of like you can do everything else. It seems like in some ways you can do everything else. The research I'm talking about is actually, it's fascinating research because it was daily diaries of students. So they asked kids on a daily basis to diary about their experience in a certain learning experience and what the teacher did and how they responded. And so across 50 days, they looked at these diary entries and across a big sample of kids. And that's where they found choice is actually not that big of a deal. It's like, it's not the one that you should harp on, or really worry about. What does matter is if the kids' opinions and preferences and perspectives aren't really valued, that's what sticks with them across time. So the next question, you have your own students in some ways, as a principal, who are your teachers, who are learning. You're asking them to learn constantly, learn new techniques, learn new ways of thinking about the issues in their classroom. How important do you think ownership at the professional learning level is to establish the conditions for student ownership?
The reality is they're interconnected. In this, I think to Zaretta Hammond and her work, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And in the very first chapter, the very first thing she talks about is the concept of dependent versus independent learners, right? And that the ultimate goal of education should be to create independent learners. And when I think about the teacher element of ownership, it's very much the same thing. I can always tell where I need to go with a staff member if they are coming to me with a problem and then they just kind of drop the problem in my lap and walk away and be like, solve it for me. Or if they come to me and say, I see a problem, here's what I think I'm going to do. Can I get some support in that? And the difference between where I'm going to go or be able to go with those two teachers is night and day, right? So that ownership of the teacher that comes with solutions because they're taking ownership of what's happening in their classroom, their own professional growth, they're seeking out solutions, they're sending me articles like, hey, I read this, I think someone else might benefit from it.
Yeah.
That really is somebody that I can then work with them. The unfortunate thing is the teacher that just drops the problem in my lap, unfortunately, it's usually on the bottom of a pile of a gazillion other problems that have been dropped in my lap that day. And so I don't always actually have the time to actually address the problem for them. And so with WACA in particular, we've been working really hard to establish that element of ownership of our own learning. Like, how are we engaging? How are we asking really hard questions? I won't say it's easy, and I will say connected to just the learning environment we're in right now. Our capacity for creativity, our bandwidth is shrunk, right? That stress, the trauma that we're experiencing, the trauma fatigue we're feeling as we support our students. And if you watch the news, you'll know that Woodburn in particular has been affected by COVID in a particularly harsh way. So that trauma piece is hard, and like helping people through that to get to that place of creative problem solving has been not always the easiest thing. But what we're really trying to embrace right now is like you said at the beginning, is the vulnerability. Like we're channeling our inner Brene Brown and
Mhm.
watching for issues of shame that come up when we look at our data and we look at what's happening in our classrooms.
Mhm.
And we look to embrace those pieces of like using failure as our fuel and trying to address it in a different way. And then, from there, it's a lot about just like asking questions. That's what I find myself doing more as a leader than anything else. And it's the same thing we'd want for our teachers, right? For student ownership to exist, we really want teachers to be asking more questions than they're providing answers.
Mm.
And my most masterful teachers are teachers who I've never heard answer a question. Like I have a
Mm.
teacher in particular, watching him is amazing. And you can see the moment of frustration on the student's face when they ask the question and he like grabs his chin and he looks and he goes, well, what about? And he asks a question back and they're just like, they're waiting for the answer. They're just like, give me the answer. And it's like, I'm going to point you in the direction of the book, or I'm going to point you to the direction of a resource by asking you a
Wow.
question, but I'm never going to give you the answer. And they always find it. They always find it. And I think that's that independent learner that's being developed versus if you wait long enough, if you hold your breath long enough, the teacher's just going to give it to me. Right. And then it's like, we're waiting instead. We're waiting.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so trying to find that balance between how do I ask really good questions so that teachers start to find their own answers, and how does that in turn shift to what am I asking my students to do?
Yeah.
It's not always
Wow.
easy. It's not always easy, especially when there are moments. I try to make it so that the questions I answer are the ones where they're saying, I figured out my issue. I need a resource. Can you give me an answer to this? And it's like, yes, what do you need? I'll
Yeah.
throw whatever you need at it. But I'm not gonna always be able to be the one that gives you the answer to it.
That's what a great insight. What a great insight. I mean, that um, it resonates with the data that I really like to share with teachers whenever I'm talking to teachers around, how many questions students ask in school on a daily basis goes to zero in middle school,
Mhm.
goes to zero. And if kids aren't asking questions, what's that mean about the curiosity that they're continuing to develop? What does it mean about who's really taking ownership over the learning? So that's a really interesting indicator too, is to think about, when you're looking at this classroom level, all right, how many questions are kids asking? And then also, how much time are teachers leaving for the space, that awkward space of silence, where they're asking a question, or a student asks a question, they're like, well, who has an answer, right? Who else? Does anyone have? So question asking, what a beautiful, important indicator around ownership of learning. So thank you for sharing that. One little bit of research that resonates with, I think, what we have seen at WACA, and maybe others who are listening can resonate with, in the just around the end of the school year, this last school year, as the pandemic was really kind of settling in. I conducted a survey with teachers in the Makespace project, and it was looking at questions around around their well-being, and also around what kind of support they felt in their environment for creativity, among other questions. But what was really curious to me was that the perceived support for creativity in their school was the most highly correlated construct or factor with their overall positive well-being in school, and beyond anything else, and which was really fascinating to me. And it didn't matter how much self-efficacy and creative teaching they had. It didn't matter what kind of level of creativity they felt in themselves, which I think is just really powerful. So there's something there. I'll just leave that with others to think about. We have another poll everywhere question here coming up. So since we're kind of on that topic, what matters most to develop ownership of learning for students? And I'm adding the link to the article, the research that I was just talking about, creativity and well-being. So relationships, mindset, willingness to try, comfort. feeling safe to contribute and get the answer wrong, encouragement for resiliency, and yes, relating to interests and learning has to be adapted to the modalities. That is so important. I mean, that's where the arts integration stuff just sort of shines. It's like all the different modalities, whether it's with their bodies, with rhyme and metaphor and linguistic tricks, with the visual arts, with storytelling. We're having a native scholar and some native educators speak to the Makespace teachers at the Winter Institute coming up about storytelling. Space for curiosity and failure and reflection. Teachers trusting their students. Yeah, these are all really strong. Accountability. Yeah, we all need accountability, don't we? It's part of the collaboration, I think. One of the most important parts of collaboration. And teaching and learning is a collaborative endeavor, isn't it? This is great. Well, we'll have one more poll everywhere in just a few minutes. So, Sean asked, what was Ross's last point? Well-being is intricately connected to teachers' perceived support for creativity in their building. And I put the article up here. It's a Frontiers article. It's publicly available. That's in the link to everybody if you're curious. And there's some more interesting findings in there that it's right at the heart of the pandemic. So it's sort of capturing that context. The next question, for you, Desiree, is, what stories come to mind, if there are any? You've shared quite a few already, but, anything that you've seen around ownership of learning and vulnerability and relationship building and what that looks like when it's happening, when teachers are taking that risk of offering more ownership opportunity.
Yeah. So, connected to kind of everything we've been talking about, I think one of the things that we're working to do at WACA is, break down some of those myths that teachers have held dear for a long time. And when I say teachers, I include myself in that. I think it connects to like we were talking about before, the culturally responsive, that we, when we're building connections to the why of the learning, that it needs to be directly connected to their why, not necessarily what our why is.
Yeah.
That I, want to echo that point that you made around the difference between voice and choice. I think sometimes choice is one of those misconceptions that's really hard because there's so much about learning and education in a formal sense that we don't get choice on. We have state standards that we need to meet, et cetera. So choice does come through more in those modalities. It's the choice is about how can I show what I've learned? How can I connect what I've learned to something that is valuable to me? That is where the piece around choice and voice comes in, and more strongly, not always. I think sometimes it goes to that direction with teachers where the choice gets out of hand, where it's like, I let them choose so much that really we're not actually measuring what we need to measure at this point, or holding them to a standard that ultimately I want them to be able to do. I think too, one of the other misconceptions that we're breaking down, Gretchen Rubin, in her book, The Four Tendencies, she talks about, and I'm going to probably not quote it exactly, but she talks about the concept that sometimes we have to get away from thinking that everything has to be intrinsically motivated, that there are some things in life that we are not intrinsically motivated to do. We do it because we're extrinsically motivated, and that's okay. And that sometimes to get students to some intrinsic motivation, that ownership is really key, or just kind of convincing them that the relationship we have with them, being that, I think to once again, to the culturally responsive, being that warm demander is enough, right? I can get you to some extrinsic because you value the relationship you have. The example of taxes that was just popped up in the chat, absolutely a good one, right? She, I think, uses an actual example, at least in an interview I heard, of like, there's nobody who's going to tell me that you can become intrinsically motivated to do quadratic equations. Like there just isn't. And so how do we break down some of those notions, and how do like kind of demystifying those a little bit, and kind of calling them out as like, that's not completely true, or it's something that we say is true to kids to see if they can get there. But actually, if we just were honest, when I was a teacher, I used to say to students forever that like, in real life, you have deadlines. You absolutely have deadlines, and you have to meet deadlines, and deadlines. And then there was the day where I reached down, we got a bill that said that we were overdue, that we didn't pay our car payment. I kind of panicked. Then we realized that it slipped between the car seats. We called, we said, sorry, it slipped between the car seats. We'll get it paid. They said, no problem. You're doing a good job on your payments. You don't need to worry about it. And what we realized is like, you can actually be late as long as you advocate for yourself. Like the advocating is actually the better skill than always being on time. But also you can't always be late. You can't just advocate your way out. So there's a balance, but teachers tend to only side on the one side versus the realization that sometimes the better skill to learn is how to speak up and say, I need something here.
Yeah.
So I think when we break down some of those myths, when we hear ourselves going to like this place of this is always true, questioning the cultural roots of that, where did that start, and does it belong in our system? And then how do we leverage that to kind of say to students, okay, let's build some new truths together, right? And that's where the ownership can really shine. And I think in that very sense, because when you break down some of those things that we've leaned on for a really long time as educators, that in and of itself is about being vulnerable, right? As a teacher, because those are things that we've leaned on really heavily in hopes to get compliance or alignment. And that being able to say, oh, that's not exactly true. Let's develop a new truth together. That starts to build those trust pieces. And so for me, where I've seen it just shine is where it's in spaces where, on the surface, they feel like they should be really trusting. Like I think about an art classroom, and there's this, I think, accepted concept that like those spaces are, of course, they're trusting and they're open because, kids are in there because they love to do art, but actually they're probably some of the most vulnerable spaces in our school. And that teacher, some of our art teacher, our theater teachers, our band teachers are continually breaking down barriers to create a really trusting relationship amongst themselves and with her or with him, so that kids are willing to be vulnerable. In a really simple demonstration of this, like the amount of art that I've seen students produce during the pandemic has been mind shattering. Like it's because they see it as a safe space, and they're using their art to process things that are really hard right now. Especially for kids. They are producing plays and doing amazing stuff in our theater department. They're about to do a radio drama that they're going to be on. They are editing together band concerts and choir concerts. And I will tell you, like, for me, in the moment where my choir director sent me a video, and it's like, can you post this on our website? And it was just kids singing to their cell phones. I thought, I find myself to be a really open person. There's no way you could pay me enough to sing to myself alone in my room and then post it on YouTube. And yet we got a group of kids to do it. And that's all about all of this, right?
Wow. Great. Yeah, it really is. I mean, that myth busting part that you were talking about, and establishing new kind of culture around, the fact that you don't have to love everything that you do, and be driven. I mean, that is a fact of life. And in the self-determination theory, where all that comes out of, they actually hold like there's 3 different aspects of, extrinsic motivation, and the one where it's like most internalized, it shows about the same as intrinsic motivation in terms of what it leads to in outcomes. So if, but it's an adoption, it's an integration into your value system, into what you care about. And you have to take time for that. I mean, yeah. I try to do that with my kids and chores in our house, and I'm finding mild degrees of success every now and then. I would love to move on. I think we're going to just go right to the final kind of pull everywhere. And maybe we can kind of integrate this, when you think about students in the classroom, what are some ideas and thinking that you have now after this session? So what kind of new things are you thinking about?
And as they're talking, Ross, as they're typing, I'm going to share one other thing, because we had talked about it during our kind of prepping for this. But I didn't get a chance to kind of mention it. I think there's another piece of ownership that is about how do we honor and really acknowledge the strengths that kids are bringing to the table, and that by connecting what we're doing to what they already are doing, that is really about ownership too, right? Building on something that, whether it's because it's important to them or because it's just a responsibility they have. So one of the things that we had talked about prior is that, like, WACA and our whole campus is actually looking at ways to get students credit for those things that are happening during a pandemic that are really unique to our situation. Mm-hmm. Kids who are taking care of younger brothers and sisters are getting childcare credit because they're basically being moms and dads. Wow. We're doing cadet teaching credit for kids who are sitting next to their siblings and helping them work through their classwork and coursework. And we're doing a lot of job study credit for kids who, for Woodburn in particular, we have a lot of frontline workers, and because of the way COVID's hit, a lot of our kids have been asked to get into the job field, work at grocery stores, et cetera, to help with family support. And so making sure they get credit for that, to honor the work that they're doing, because they're putting a lot of themselves in there. And that is part of the ownership, is saying we see where you're at, and we want to acknowledge the learning that you're doing while you do that.
Wow. Yeah, what a big step. What a big step. And I mean, what kind of comes, all these benefits of what, when you provide that ownership and you show that that's valued, what that means for that student and how they feel about themselves. And and that, like, at what point does a certain number of credits lost because of this pandemic feel like it's just not possible to overcome, and so just even a little bit of, like, hey, there's possibility. That's pretty amazing. Good luck with that. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be, tricky but kind of an amazing innovation that others hopefully will follow. We have a couple minutes left here. Are there questions that have popped up that people want Desiree to address, or myself, or just comments?
There's nothing in the Q&A yet, or the chat, but people should feel free to throw things in there. So.
Yeah. Throw them in there. And I know there's one last kind of question that Brandy likes to ask any panelists that are doing these webinars. So while we're waiting to see if any questions pop up, do you want to shoot us that question, Brandy?
Yes, I do. So we're just asking everyone who does these coaching clinics to tell us something that you started doing differently because of the pandemic, but that you will continue to do once it's over. So I will ask both Ross and Desiree to answer that. Before you guys go in, though, I do want to just say thank you so much for this conversation. It was really great. I love to just hear, it's little things, it's a pandemic, but I think these are the things we are hearing people within our community and network doing that, are really changing things for students as far as their learning experience. So thank you both. So I will throw it to Desiree first, and then Ross.
Sure. So for me, I always thought I was a pretty good communicator, but I have upped my communication game like no other, and just really worked on being a continual communicator, even if that communication is no news yet. And so
Mhm.
I'm using videos, I'm using blogs, I have a little podcasty type thing that I do, all kinds of different things just to make sure that my staff are hearing from me. And then a lot of times hearing from my face, even if they can't be in person. So I've had to get over my social affect and just kind of get myself on camera and be okay with that. But I've seen really good results from it. And the trust and transparency it's created has been invaluable.
Mm,
Great.
that's awesome. I would say one thing, and I'll just share that if there, the Makespace project is grant funded, there are opportunities for other communities to get involved. If you feel like this could be something you're interested in, reach out to me. My email address is, I think, on the webinar information, but it's also up there, ross.anderson@inflexion.org. I've been documenting now for 100 days. Sometimes it accumulates and I go back to it a couple days later, but for 100 days, I've documented a metaphor that I've noticed or that has come to mind. It's part of a TEDx talk that I'm giving this April, but it's made me feel like just trying to notice things and observe things and just do the act of actually observing and noticing something and writing it down. It doesn't really matter what it is. For me, it's metaphor right now. But I think that there's something in that is actually, I'm going to carry forward because I think there's a certain attention that it gives me to the details that can be easily missed in life, to appreciate the beauty, the things to celebrate, and that's, I'm definitely going to continue it going forward. Thank you for offering this opportunity for myself and for Desiree. And Desiree, thank you so much. I know you are so busy, so yeah. I owe you one. Let me know what I can do to make it up. But I really enjoyed everything you had to share, and I've enjoyed this quite a bit. So we'll.
And Michelle, did we have anything come in?
Yeah, so there is a question in the chat for Ross or Desiree, if you want to jump in and address. You can probably read it. It's a little long, but about kind of the more traditional structure in classrooms. And would one of you like to address that?
Well, I know I sent her a private message. It's not easy, and it's been 4 years in the making for WACA. It's a gradual chipping away, and don't give up on it yet. I think sometimes it's just the little teeny things that start to change. For a lot of my teachers, the Makespace was about like one small practice. That's it. And that's where it started. And then it grew from there. So a small practice of having an opportunity for uncertainty, a small practice of thinking through a problem in a different way or a different modality. But it's a gradual chipping away. So trust me, I'm tired some days.
But, I think the one thing that, the big kind of gamble that we took in the Makespace project, but it was learning after 4 years of trying to do arts integration work with middle school teachers across 5 schools, and just learning like, there's like a system of beliefs that we all carry and they're powerful. They are the chief motivator, everything below the surface. And how do you shift beliefs? It's slow process that's got to be reflective. And so the first 18-hour course for the Makespace project is so reflective on, we ask teachers a lot about their own beliefs around creativity, really trying to break down some of these myths around what should student engagement look like? What does ownership look like? What do you think about your own creative potential and the creative potential of your students? And what we find is that there's a lot of contradictions in that belief system. And I think you can't address those contradictory beliefs. You don't know what's going to prime one belief or the other. A fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. You like the triggers are you don't know, and so you have to bring that to the surface, I think. And that the one thing that I can say from the research we've done is like we've shifted beliefs. Their beliefs are being shifted, and the system of beliefs is being shifted around creativity, around student motivation. And I think that just is this key to kind of turning over little by little, like you were saying, little practices. So like the belief system, then at micro moments, kind of activating and testing it. And then when you test it and it doesn't, burst into flames, then it's like, okay, I'll test it again. I'll try like a little risk here and there. And so it is really small baby steps, but those baby steps are what kind of provides the opportunity to take those risks is really a shifting in thinking. And that has to happen through reflection. And I think the bigger, if you have a full group of teachers, community of practice kind of looking at that and stepping into some of these uncertainties, it seems to be more effective than, just a teacher at a time or, but yeah, belief systems are powerful. And like you were sharing around, motivation, choice, like we saw a lot of people coming into this saying choice is something that's really important around ownership of learning. And surely it is, but we have this, it's become this sort of untested assumption that that's really what matters. And sometimes that's above the surface. So you don't have to worry about relationships and vulnerability. If you're like, well, I'm giving them choice, I'm giving my students choice. And I think same thing with the adults that we're working with. So don't give up.